Gracias por estar acá, es un honor tener aquí a Christopher Merrill, un gran poeta americano, pero además un gran gestor de la literatura y difusor y promotor de la literatura americana en el mundo, pero además generador de redes en todo el mundo. Ha trabajado generando redes con la literatura desde Irán a Palestina, a Israel, viene de Hong Kong, digamos, en todos los países asiáticos. También es un gran conocedor de la literatura mundial, dirige el programa La Residencia de Escritores de la Universidad de Iowa, un programa que recibe 29 escritores más o menos por año de todo el mundo, generando redes además de escritores internacionales, y además fue electo por Obama para desarrollar dentro de sus dos gobiernos una tarea muy importante en diplomacia cultural. Así que, bueno, un poco nos va a compartir toda esta experiencia. Lo que yo le planteé es que él hable un tiempo, va a hablar en inglés. Lo que pensábamos con Sergio es quienes quieran hacer preguntas en español, nosotros la podemos traducir, os ayudamos a traducir. Lo mismo, digamos, si necesitan, o sea, nos vamos ayudando digamos, ¿no? para fluir. Christopher ya sabe. Y bueno, para mí personalmente es un honor tenerlo aquí en Argentina. Es la primera vez que viene a Argentina. Argentina es un país muy importante de la literatura. Ha recibido muchos escritores el programa de Iowa, entre ellos a mí. O sea, y para mí me cambió la vida ese programa. Así que bueno, es una forma de devolverle todo lo que hizo por la literatura argentina también en estas redes que integró. Thank you very much. Welcome. It's an honor for us to have you here. And okay, you start and
Thank you.
Okay, then we open the conversation. Okay.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you all for coming here. I'm sorry I can't be doing this in Spanish. I have often joked that my father majored in Spanish in college, and so, of course, I decided to study French, to my eternal regret. I have a formal paper. I don't think I'll give it. I'm just going to talk around greetings around this idea of poetry and diplomacy. As you noted, I direct the international writing program at the University of Iowa, where for 56 years now we've been hosting great writers from around the world. We usually have in residence 30 to 40 writers, poets, fiction writers, playwrights, essayists, screenwriters. They come to Iowa City, which is UNESCO City of Literature, for 11 weeks. And I say to the writers on the first day that I hope that by the end of their time, they will have written many new pages, they will have made many new friends, and they will have a deeper understanding of many different literary traditions because they will have been in daily contact with writers from around the world. I've been directing the program since 2000, which means that I'm actually quite old. And after being in Hong Kong last week and here this week, I am feeling older yet. But I thought I would tell you a little something about my work as a writer, and then in the larger conversation about cultural diplomacy and the place that poetry might fit into those larger strategic aims of, let's say, the State Department, the U.S. State Department. One thing I should tell you, everywhere I go, I'm always bringing a book by the French poet, diplomat, Saint-Jean, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1960. He was first and foremost a great diplomat who also wrote poems. And his Nobel address is of particular interest to me because it ends with this one sentence: "And it is enough for the poet to be the guilty conscience of his time." Mm-hmm. And I've always loved that idea, and I've always thought hard about what Saint-Jean accomplished both as a diplomat and as a poet. He was born in the New World in Guadeloupe. His family, they had been in the Caribbean for roughly 150 years when the family plantation was destroyed in an earthquake. So at the age of 12, Paris, that was his literary name. His real name was Alexis Léger de Léger. Traveled back to France, got the conventional French education, and as a young man joined the Foreign Service. His first posting was to what we now call Beijing, China, in those days, Peking. And he was in Peking for only about 6 weeks or so before he wrote a letter back to his boss at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, in which he accurately predicted that in only a few years, there would be a proletarian revolution in China. And I've often thought, how could he have figured this out as a young diplomat / writer who didn't know he couldn't speak Mandarin Chinese. He had English and French. Those were the two languages he had. But what he had was the ability to listen to what his interlocutors were talking about. And unlike many diplomats, he made a point of visiting out with the people, getting to know Chinese people who, of course, they had to be mostly men who had at least enough English or French for him to be able to communicate. But by listening hard and keeping his eyes open, he could see what was coming down the pike. Between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, it was said that in France that all across Europe that prime ministers come and go, but Léger remains. He was the most important diplomat in the interwar years. He helped to write what would eventually become the Charter of the United Nations. In those days, it was for the Brigham-Kelly Act. And in Munich, the very famous Munich conference in 1936, 1937, where both the French and the English delegations essentially acceded to Hitler's demand that they let him have Czechoslovakia. Paris was the only member of the French delegation to say, you can't do this. You cannot appease this madman from Berlin. And so, of course, when the Nazis invaded France, by then he had already been run out of office and had to flee from Paris. 5 manuscripts that he had completed writing disappeared because one of the first stops the Nazis made was to his flat. And I've always had this dream that at some point those manuscripts would reappear. I had hoped that with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the opening of various holdings around the Soviet bloc that those manuscripts would reappear. Unfortunately, they never did. But he wrote a poem, a book-length poem, on that first posting in China called Anabasis, or Expedition, that is one of the most remarkable books of poetry in our time. Nobody sounded like Saint-Jean before him or after him. And so he became a really interesting figure as a poet for me. He leaves, he has to flee from Paris and then eventually from Paris to the US. And he's great friends with Archibald MacLeish, who was at the time the Librarian of Congress. And MacLeish wanted to give Paris a job just to get some money into his hands. And he said, I want to make you a consultant to the Library of Congress. Paris declined because, as he said, he still belonged to the French Foreign Service. So technically, he could not receive money from the US government. MacLeish went out, found some private funding, gave the position to Paris. Most people, given such a sinecure, would just take the money and write. But Paris actually took the job seriously. And the reason I wanted to tell this story is I'm talking to people in a humanities program. what Paris did during the war, in addition to writing some incredible book-length poems, one called Rains, one called Winds, and then to start his major work, Sea Marks, he drew up an annotated bibliography of some 900 books and texts that, in his view, if you were to be interested in any kind of international affairs, these were the 900 texts you had to read. And they encompassed not just literature, but history, geography, law, economics. It's a serious collection of writings that spans all the continents. And when I first had a chance to actually read through that bibliography, I realized, oh, that's what is behind all of these fantastic poems. In the poems, you don't hear anything of that remarkable learning that he had. His learning is not at all on display. What's on display is delight in the world and understanding of what people will do to one another in their best moments and in their worst moments. Just a deep sense of what the human condition might be all about. And so I took that as a sort of model for how I would do the work that I do. I run the International Writing Program. It's funded to a considerable extent by the US Department of State. When it began in 1967, it was begun, the connection with the State Department was a result of correspondence between the former director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, Paul Engel, and the Chilean novelist, Jose Donoso. And it was Donoso who suggested to Engel that if he was to create this international writing program, let it be a space where writers from all over the world could come and speak freely and frankly about the various issues of the day. Engel had in mind, of course, the Soviet bloc on the one hand, but he also was married to a Chinese novelist, so he had a great understanding of Asia. And those are the conditions that led to the creation of the International Writing Program. So I came there, it ran beautifully for about 20 years when Paul and Wally Engel were running it. They retired, and at that point, let's say the University of Iowa made a disastrous decision in who they hired to run the program after that, and he ran the program into the ground. So I was brought in 2000 to rebuild this program, which was quite an undertaking. I had to get familiar with lawyers and the auditors and accountants to try to figure out how to rebuild this program. I was there for 1 year when we had the US experienced 9/11, which changed everything for people doing the kind of work that I do. I was saying to my companions here, Cynthia and Julia, that on the morning of 9/11, I was on the phone with our general counsel because we had a writer from Myanmar who had managed to drink himself into a stupor 3 days in a row. Each day he was taken to the emergency room of the hospital. And on the third day, which happened to be September 10th, 2001, they said, okay, 3 strikes and you're out. Now you have to be committed to a detoxification program here at the hospital. So I flew home to find out, oh my God, I was in Sarajevo. You know, I've got this writer who's undergoing a detoxification regimen at the hospital. And I was on the phone with the university's lawyer, general counsel, when she said, do you have your TV on? I said, no. She said, turn your TV on. And I turned it on in time to see the second plane hit the World Trade Center. And of course, that meant for me as the director of the program that I would spend the rest of that day in meetings with the public security, public safety people talking about, how to protect the Muslim writers in our program, what might be coming next. At the end of one of those meetings, the judge who signed the commitment orders for this Burmese writer called me, and she said, you won't believe it, but they have the TV on in the psych ward, and your poor drunken writer is having to sober up among lunatics who think they masterminded the attack on the World Trade Center. I thought that was maybe not the most judicious way to describe what the Burmese writer had to do, but those were the sorts of things that we also deal with in running a program like this. The immediate effect after 9/11 for us was that, of course, as you know, we invaded Afghanistan, and then on spurious intelligence invaded and occupied Iraq. And so within a couple of years, whatever sympathy the United States had garnered as a result of the attack on our homeland had dissipated, and there was a lot of anger everywhere around the world, which then led people in the States to try to figure out what we did wrong, right? So at that time, now President Biden, in those days, he was Senator Biden, a Democrat, and Richard Lugar, a Republican, and our then Congressman, Jim Leach, the most liberal Republican in Congress, put together a task force on cultural diplomacy. I was appointed to that, and then had the good luck to travel around the world trying to see how other countries put together cultural diplomacy programs. By cultural diplomacy, I mean the exchange of information and ideas, preferably person to person. A program like the International Writing Program would be an example of cultural diplomacy writ large. I ended up writing the report for that, and then had the good luck to, try to implement what we might make out of these findings, which could be boiled down to one idea, that we should think about cultural diplomacy not just as American writers, Americans hosting writers from around the world, but think of it as a two-way conversation, bringing American writers out into the world, doing things that we might be able to figure out on over the internet. This was in the early days of social media, which now has become such a big part of our lives. And so what had been for 35 years a program of hosting writers from abroad, that's still the central mission of the IWP, but we started doing some other kinds of things. And I want to give you some examples of that as we talk about what we do. So as one aside, in, let's say, 2007, the State Department asked me to figure out a way to travel to Iran. We have no diplomatic relations with Iran, and they were interested in seeing what I, as a non-diplomat, just as an ordinary citizen, might be able to work out with different entities in the Islamic Republic. It took 2 years for me to actually travel to Iran, because it's not easy to get a visa, for an American to get a visa to go to Iran. And when I finally got a visa to go, the visa being sponsored by the University of Tehran, I flew into Tehran and was immediately pulled aside for long interrogation for a very long time. And I thought, oh, this is going to be complicated. And after many hours, I was released, and I took up residence at the University of Tehran. The only other people in residence at the time was a Chinese delegation of 7 or 8 academics, and a lonely German professor who would come to Tehran every 3 months to teach German for a couple of weeks. And thus began an exploration of various ways of thinking in Iran. I flew to Shiraz on the second day there. In one of the rickety planes, I was traveling with an Iranian American professor who said, you know, as a result of the sanctions on Iran, there were no spare parts for their airplanes. So now I'm flying in one of these old planes, and my colleague said to me, these planes are crap, but the pilots are really good, so you don't need to worry. I thought, oh. So I flew to Shiraz, and I started thinking about what kinds of things we might be able to do, what sort of projects we might be able to create. I went to see the shrine of Hafez, the great Sufi poet, and the shrine of Sadi, also a great Sufi poet. And I started getting ideas. We made a drive in an old beat-up car from Shiraz to Persepolis to Isfahan for 8 hours it took there. And then we flew back to Tehran. And when I went into the airport in Isfahan, I walk in and there are guards there, armed guards, and one of them points to me and asks my colleague, "Who is that?" And my colleague said, "He's an American." And you know, your stereotype as an American would be to think, "Oh, now I'm in trouble," right? And he big smile on his face. "We love Americans." I thought, well, that's interesting. That's not the story we get in the US, right? And then I went to go through security. This was the days of Blackberries. I forgot to take my Blackberry out, so that all the buzzers go off, and that guard turns to my friend and says, what's the deal? And my friend said, "Oh, he's an American." "Ah, that's fine. Just go through. You know, you probably are an American. You won't have a gun on you." Yeah, I mean, really. So then we got to Tehran, and we did a bunch of different activities at the university. There was a meeting with the graduate students and the faculty, much like we are here today. And at a certain point, somebody read back to me a paragraph or two from the report I wrote on cultural diplomacy and asked if I still believed what I had written in that report. And I said, "Where did you even find that report?" And the Iranian professor sitting next to me said, "We've read everything you've written. You have no idea how much we know about you." And I thought, oh, that's not good. So we had these really interesting conversations. On the next to last day, I had a meeting with the vice president for external relations, who was a very cultured mullah. He'd been the ambassador to Canada. His English was flawless. And he said, "So what do you want to do? What's your idea?" And what I had been thinking about the whole time we were traveling around was that to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the International Writing Program, I had brought together 6 other poets from 5 different countries. And over the course of 4 days, we wrote a book of poems together. It's called 7 Poets, 4 Days, 1 Book. And I said to the vice president, "It may interest you to know that my best friend of 20 years was a Kashmiri poet who challenged American poets to write, as he said, real ghazals in English, and that he had put together a book about of ghazals, and he had recently passed away." And I said, "You know, I'm thinking that we would bring Iranian poets and American poets together to write a book of ghazals together." And he looked at me, and it was sort of, I think I would imagine he was frankly astonished that somebody would propose such a crazy sounding thing. And I've sometimes thought, you know, what was he thinking? He might have thought, well, this guy is definitely not with the CIA if he's proposing something like this. Or then maybe his next thought might have been, well, if he is with the CIA and he's proposing something like this, we have nothing to worry about. if he's with the CIA and he's proposing something like this, maybe they have some other thing going on. And then he just said, yeah, I think that could work. So what happened over the next few years was we put together a conference of poets from Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkey, and the United States in Konya, Turkey, where Rumi spent most of his adult life. And the idea was to try to think about what connections there might be among all these different writers to the example and the achievement of Rumi. It was an incredibly tense conference. We had Iranian exiles there, along with professors of Persian literature in Tehran, always this close to erupting, right? And I thought, well, I hope this doesn't turn bad. But as I'm often saying to my staff, I love a project that has a high probability of being a spectacular failure. Because that means you're doing something that it could go catastrophically wrong, or it could be pretty amazing. In the end, we put together a book and a film about this that was pretty great. So that's one big idea. The second thing we did, because we have no diplomatic relations, the State Department said, could you think of a way to do something on our virtual embassy that would introduce some aspect of American literature to an Iranian audience? I thought long and hard about that. And then I remember that in my first year on the job in 2000, a colleague in the English department named Ed Folsom had offered to do a presentation about Walt Whitman's life for the visiting writers. It turned out that Whitman was the most photographed person in the 19th century. So he was a kind of celebrity in the way that we think of celebrity today. We would joke he was like the Madonna of the 19th century, okay? This was back, we're talking when Madonna was somebody else. And so what I proposed was, I said, why don't we look at Song of Myself, which is in 52 sections. We'll do we'll do one section every week. My colleague Ed will write an introduction to the section. I'll write a kind of poetic commentary. We'll pose a question and we'll translate it into Farsi. And they went for it, the State Department, and we started to put together Whitman Web, and I'm just going to give you a peek at it here. And what we did, you can see it here in Spanish, Ed said, Whitman translations exist in a lot of different languages. Why don't we think about expanding this from just English and Persian to these other languages? I found some money for, we had a Russian poet from Uzbekistan in our program that fall. I found money for her to translate the commentaries and introductions. And about 3 weeks into that project, she said to me, the section you and Ed are writing about here, it doesn't exist in our Russian translation. The standard Russian translation of Song of Myself was missing 19 sections. So we took that as an excuse or an inspiration to commission the first full-length translation of Song of Myself in Russian. So now we have Russian. We have 2 different Arabic versions. We have the Spanish version, we have German, we have a French version. We're just about to launch, if you can believe it, a version in Frisian, which is the language of one of the smaller languages in Belgium. 15 languages altogether. And if you're interested in this, you can go to the website. I wonder, will I be able to get, will there be sound on this if I click on this?
Yeah.
Okay. So here it is in the Persian translation. And one of the two translators, Sholeh Pope, I just want you to hear Whitman in Persian.
میگیرم خود را می‌سرایم خود را و هرچه پندار من پندار تو خواهد بود چرا که هر ذره من به همان مایه جوهر فرد توست هرزه می‌گردم و روحم را فرا می‌خوانم لمیده ولنگار به فراق خویش در تماشای نیزه‌ای از علف تابستانی زبانم هر ذره خونم سرشته این خاک و هواست زاده پدر و مادری اینجا از پدر و مادری زاده همان نیاکان و نیاکانشان همان اینک در 37 سالگی من در سلامت کامل آغاز می کنم باشد که باز نایستم تا دم مرگ مرام ها و مکتب ها در تعلیق اگرچه هرگز از خاطر نرفتند چندی گوشه گرفتند خوشنود بر آنچه هستند
That's what it sounds like in Persian. Now just so you can hear a little of the English. This is by an American actor named Eric Forsyth.
Song of Myself. 1. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents born here, from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard, nature, without check, with original energy.
So there's an example of a cultural diplomacy project done to highlight something about American literature, to have an exchange between Iranian readers and an American writer. Interestingly, the reason that the Russian translation was missing 19 sections was, among other things, Whitman is extolling the virtues of democracy, of individual rights. Whitman was gay. So there are, let's say, for the Russians in the Soviet Empire in the 1920s, these are taboo subjects. It's one of the reasons why we have two Arabic versions of the poem. Whitman is always addressing you, and the you could be a lover, it could be the whole mass of humanity, it could be the cosmos. In Arabic, there is no pronoun of a you, so you have to choose in those sections whether the you is going to be a he or a she. One version, it's a male lover, in the other version, it's a female lover. So you can imagine the complications. This exists as well in Persian. So I assumed every week that we would get shut down. We were doing this on Facebook, and it was also on the virtual embassy website, and we never got shut down. It stayed up the whole time. We got lots of likes from Iran, which gave me this sense that in cultural diplomacy, you can have the kinds of conversations that almost by definition cannot take place on the political level, right? You can have conversations that really count in human affairs. So that's how we came to do this. And it comes out of my larger engagement with the world. I wrote my first prose book was about the 1990 World Cup. which did not end well for Argentina. It was sort of the end of Maradona's brilliance. But I went from that then to write two books about the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia. Went on to write a book about pilgrimages I made to the holy mountain of Athos in northern Greece. Then a book about travels in the Middle East, Malaysia, and China. So I'm always trying to figure out what happens between different cultures, and sometimes something in the line of what I imagine Saint-Jean-Perse did as a poet and as a diplomat. There's a story of him in every meeting. He had a separate notebook, and from time to time, he would hear something in a meeting, and his colleagues would see him jot something down in that notebook. Inevitably, they came to imagine it was probably lines of poetry that occurred to him in his interactions with the different world leaders he had to deal with. So when I came to write a book called The Tree of the Doves, Ceremony, Expedition, War, it began with a 60 or 70 page essay about my travels in China. At the very end of Léger's posting in China, he made a trip from Peking to Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia by train, car, camel, and horseback. So I made the trip just by train with a colleague from Beijing to Ulaanbaatar to try to meditate on what Saint-Jean-Perse accomplished as a poet and what he did and did not accomplish as a diplomat. So that'll give you a sense of the prose part of my life. And then, of course, I'm always trying to write poems. The most recent book that's come out is began on a cultural diplomacy mission to Ukraine in 2006. I was driving west in the coldest winter in memory when in an unheated van. Yes, the U.S. Embassy is cheap. People don't experience that around the world. And the Foreign Service national, who was my control officer, who was escorting me around Ukraine, was a woman of a certain age who was clearly going through menopause. Because every few minutes she would wind the window down, having a hot flash. And I was in the back of this van with a rather petite Ukrainian novelist who had been in our program, a woman, a dear friend. And we were so cold that we took all our clothes out of our suitcases and covered ourselves during these hot flashes. And to take my mind off how cold I was, I started writing some lines, just what I was seeing as we were driving along. And I was thinking about the great Polish poet, Adam Zagajewski, who wrote a famous poem called To Go to Lvov, where he had been born. And so, I wrote a bunch of lines, maybe 30, 40 lines during that trip. And when I came back to the Iowa City, every now and then I would write some more lines on it, sensing that there was something more there. I was making that first cultural diplomacy mission in the wake of the Orange Revolution. That was the start of Ukraine really breaking away from, not just from the Soviet Union, but from Russia proper. And after the Maidan Revolution in 2014, which inspired Vladimir Putin to invade eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and then to occupy Crimea, I did a second cultural diplomacy mission to Ukraine, concentrating on Kyiv and Kharkiv, places that are much in the news over the last couple of years. And then wrote some more lines and wrote some more lines. And then Adam Zagajewski got sick and died, and that inspired me to write more lines. He died about 10 months before Russia invaded Ukraine, and then Russia invaded Ukraine, and I felt compelled to keep writing. And it happened that I was going to be in Poland that spring on a Fulbright, and it was in Poznan, which had probably somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. So I kept writing, and eventually it became a book-length poem on the road to Lviv, and I don't know if you'll all be able to see it, but it's been translated into Ukrainian because I have a Ukrainian American colleague at the State Department who's a great poet named Nina Murray and a translator from Ukrainian. So she translated it into Ukrainian, and the publisher of Aerosmith Press is a Ukrainian American writer, and he said, well, put the two together, English and Ukrainian, and the book came out. And that's, I guess, from a personal level, how cultural diplomacy works in my life. And with that, I think I'll open it up and see if you have questions, comments, ideas, turn this into more of a conversation.
Okay.
Why not in English?
English.
Well, hi, my name is Gabriela Amo, and very nice to meet you. We've exchanged mails many years ago, but probably I'll tell you about that later. But it was great to listen to this and very interesting. Lots and lots of things to think about. I was wondering about two things. First, this sort of contradiction right at the beginning when you spoke about the Peirce and that the intellectual, the writers are like, it's enough if they are the bad conscience of our time, or some the guilty conscience of our time. And how that is completely different with what you do at Iowa, with the real action you do in diplomacy or in cultural management, where you are like, I have the feeling with Cynthia and everyone doing this kind of work that you have this feeling of the guiltiness or of what is bad, but then you feel it's not enough. You have to do something about it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that on one side. And then there was this question. I've been working in cultural management all my life, and I always have this horrible question, which is so managerial, is how do you measure the effect of what you do? I hate to do it, but when I was listening to everything you do there, it's amazing. It's beautiful. This page, the translations of Bushman to so many languages, but how do you really, especially in countries like ours, that takes a lot of resources, not time, money, we don't have, so we have to really choose what we do.
Yeah.
And so how do you know if what you're doing is really being useful? I know it's an awful question to know, but
I think it's the central question, not
Yeah.
just for cultural diplomacy, but for anybody involved in the humanities.
Yeah.
And we in English we call it, how do you do the metrics for this? What are the metrics?
I didn't want to talk about it like that.
And we talk about anecdotal evidence, which of course for a scientist means nothing, right? And so we talk about moving the needle a little bit. The State Department has invested many millions of dollars to create a new tool called mode analysis to try to measure what the participants in all of their cultural diplomacy programs, what they experienced about halfway through the program, what they feel at the end. Then again, 3 months later, they're sent a survey of some sort. A year later, 5 years later, and we're still trying to get our heads around how this will work, trying to formulate the kinds of questions that might be useful for measuring some aspect of the program to see if it actually makes anything better. Anecdotally, I can say that the experience of many writers, at least as reported to me and others, is that being in conversation with writers from around the world enlarges their understanding of what a writer can do, gives them broader horizon, if you will. A lot of writers do write a lot in our program and come out with new books. So we say that's on all to the good. But I'm also profoundly aware of all the arguments against it. I was on, Cynthia mentioned Obama appointed me to our National Council on the Humanities. And we're always talking about the crisis in the humanities in the States. And I understand that it's similar here and in many places. Why would you go and study English literature or philosophy or religion? And I have all kinds of reasons why, when we think about when money is tight and we have to educate the young to get a job, right? And I often think about something my late father said to me early on. He was a banker who was a Spanish major in college. And he said to me at one point that he hated to hire people with an MBA. He said, because the problem with hiring somebody with an MBA is you have to unteach them, right? They already know how to do everything. So he was more interested in philosophy majors or religion majors, because in the humanities, you learn how to distinguish between a better and a worse argument. You have to write. You have to learn how to write. You have to learn how to organize your thinking. It's hard to use that argument against those in STEM, where all the money is. And you know, it's a tough battle to fight, but we keep waging it. And I'll give you an example just from the University of Iowa to give you a sense of how this plays out at Iowa. When I arrived in Iowa City in 2000, it's the center of writing in America, right? But I found out that the Writers' Workshop really would have nothing to do with any other writing programs on campus. There was I guess you would call it a lot of factionalism. I prefer to call it the balkanization of the English departments. So we had the Writers' Workshop was in one place. The nonfiction writing program was in our English department. The translation program was in the Division of World Languages and Literatures. Then there was my program, which started out in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, then went to the Vice President for Research, and then to the Provost's office, and now we're in the Graduate College. So they're going all these different directions. So we put together a task force on the Writing University, where we brought all the different programs together to have these kinds of difficult conversations about how we might be able to work together more productively. And one of the most interesting ideas that came out of this was that undergraduates got wind of the fact that we were having this task force, and they wanted an undergraduate creative writing track. Now we're the writing university, but it turns out that we're only thinking about the graduate students, right? Mm-hmm. And so who were the biggest opponents of an undergraduate creative writing track? The Writers' Workshop. And the provost came to me and he said, our most famous writer at the time was Marilyn Robinson. She just won the Pulitzer Prize for her novel Gilead. And she said to the provost, no, we don't need to, undergraduates haven't read enough to be taught creative writing. So the provost said to me, how would you counter that argument? And I said, well, here are the problems I see with that argument. One, that's the same argument that has been used in every English department around the country when creative writers said we want to teach creative writing. And we at the University of Iowa began the process of teaching creative writing in universities. I said, isn't it funny that now, 80 years later, our graduate students are using that argument against our undergraduates? I said, that's a problem. Considering we have 350 graduate creative writing programs in America that grew out of this one program in Iowa. I said, second thing, there's 650 undergraduate creative writing programs. So this is an argument people are having. Can you teach creative writing? How do you teach creative writing? I said, don't we want to be in that argument, in that conversation? I said, and the third thing is, if we're paying the graduate students in the Writers' Workshop to teach Introduction to Creative Writing classes to undergraduates, and the Writers' Workshop believes that it can't actually be taught, then why are we giving this money to the writers' workshop? We should just stop it. And that ended up being the argument that won the day. My colleagues in the English department, there were many who were against that idea as well. But my thought was, if you bring writers together with scholars, the scholars can keep the writers honest, and the writers can remind the scholars where the texts that they research came from and how they came to be. So we had quite a raucous English department meeting before we agreed that we would put together an undergraduate creative writing track. The track was successful right from the start. So we expanded it to become a creative writing major. So now we have what you can do in English and creative writing major. Our English department is the only humanities program, not just at the University of Iowa, but we're in what's called the Big Ten, but the Big Ten is actually about 16 universities. So we clearly can't count. But we have ours is the largest humanities program by a factor of, we have 950 undergraduate English and creative writing majors, 2/3 of whom are really most interested in creative writing. So what we figured out was that undergraduates often study English literature because they really want to be writers. Now, whether they're going to become writers or not is almost beside the point. Obviously, not all of them will become writers, but the success of this major suggests to me that there is that deep hunger for understanding how creativity might work. And so now that my colleagues in the English department are very happy to have so many students, and the dean and the provost will give them lines to hire more faculty when all the other humanities programs are losing lines. And I thought, well, what that means when I think about the humanities writ large, we have to be creative to find ways to keep that argument going in the wake of all the drive to train the young in vocations that will mean something. And, you do an English literature major, and then you go out into the workforce. You might be a writer, you might be in public relations, you might be a journalist, you might be in publishing, but odds are over the course of your career, you will have a lot of lives. I fly around 100,000 miles a year. And when I was in my early 20s, I was afraid of flying. Who could guess that I would spend my life going to so many places? That's I think the nature of being alive at this moment. So how to train our students to be flexible, nimble-minded, adept at changing course when the circumstances change. And for all of our colleagues in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, also computer science, we know that in a poem or a short story or a novel, they will find a kind of knowledge that they can't find in other places, and that's part of that larger human experience. So those are the kinds of arguments I make. You still can't measure it, but anecdotes can be useful.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
I thought I might mention just one other project, just because it might be of interest for those who are interested in writing. So we did Ed and I did a Song of Myself for a year. Then we spent 2 years later, a year later, we devoted 40 weeks to Whitman's Civil War writings. He was one kind of a poet before the Civil War, and then during the Civil War and after, he became a much darker and more complex kind of poet. So we did a second round of Whitman Web, and that caused us to think, well, maybe we'll make a massive open online course about first Song of Myself and then Whitman's Civil War writings, and that was a lot of fun. So, but maybe we can expand this and do something on writing poetry, something on writing fiction. We ended up doing 15 MOOCs, as you can see here. And I bring this up because if you're interested, the courses, of course, they're closed now, but we recorded videos with writers from around the world about how to the various aspects of the art and craft of writing poetry, fiction, nonfiction, plays, and you can see some of this. There's even a course in Spanish. We have a course in flash fiction. That's a course in Arabic. All those videos are free and available for you to watch, to use, as well as the syllabi for all the courses and writing exercises, all available. You know, have at it. Just the kind of thing. We put this together, let's say we finished around 2018, and then lockdown comes and we have all these online resources that people can use.
I made that with Natasha. Yeah. Como los escritores escriben ficción, lo hice yo con ellos.
So you can see Cynthia on video.
No, I made the course,
Translation.
the translation and the text in Spanish,
Yeah.
the Latin American writers, the
Yeah.
women, you know?
Yeah.
Yes.
When
Yeah.
you remember when you were doing
Yeah,
that?
exactly. It was a difficult task, but it was amazing.
I think we paid you, right?
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
I always say like another book, please. I'm really so happy. It was a good moment of my life. I have to say. You paid me really well.
So that's just another thing that a project that came out of it. And I
And
guess-
you include in these mocks the writers that come to the residency. That's nice because there's you have writers from Nigeria and from
Yeah.
South Africa in the mocks.
Yeah. No, and we were lucky enough to ask a lot of great writers from around the world who would be willing to speak at some length. My friend, the poet Richard Kenny, called me one night when we had asked him to record a video, and he said, you can't show the video. I was going everywhere. I couldn't make sense out of it all. I sound like an idiot. And I said to him, oh, we have a really talented editor. Let's see what we can do. And we salvaged enough to make him think, okay, yeah, we can do something there. So we have, the videos are really quite interesting to look at.
I have a question. No.
Well, yes, I was very interested in the experience that you told us about the Iranian and American writers.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how it functioned and what the results of that and
So our thought was
the
we'll bring
diplomatic results. I mean,
Yeah.
if there were more understanding between the writers or about cultural things,
Yeah.
or if you envision any similar thing. I mean, we are in a very difficult moment globally,
Yeah.
and it reminded me about Barenboim,
And then I'll say,
Israeli.
a group of
Yeah.
Palestinian
Yeah.
orchestra
Yeah.
with Palestinian and Israeli.
Well, it's interesting. I was telling Cynthia and Julia, I started my day with a meeting with the Fulbright Commission in Tel Aviv. They send us every year an Israeli writer, and we usually have at least one Palestinian in residence at the same time, as well as other Arabic writers. The political differences between the two sides are always unbridgeable, irreconcilable, but they often find common ground on various things. And Birnbaum's project has always been a touchstone for me of what those conversations can be like. We're in a different place these days as a result of October 7th. The funny thing is, before October 7th, I would have said that this year's cohort of writers was the most harmonious in my 23 years at that time. After October 7th, it really got ugly. And I don't think we rose to the occasion quite well enough, because it turned out we had tried to bring a poet from Gaza who never got a visa. But he had been included in the WhatsApp group. And the coordinator of our fall residency forgot that he was there, and we never heard anything from him. He didn't get a visa, so he was still in Gaza. Then October 7th came, and he emerged in the WhatsApp group and was daily sending videos of what was going on, and that was with the right. We had a writer from Yemen, a writer from Dubai, another writer from Egypt, and it led to greater and greater divisions, and the videos were pretty horrific. And I think in retrospect we would have probably said that you can't be posting that. WhatsApp is here for people to make sure they get to this place on time. It's not a venue for raising larger political issues that cannot be bridged at this moment. But we failed to do that. And I'll give a sense of how off track we got as a result of that. I have often told a story in I think my second year of running the program after 9/11. We had a kind of amazing event one morning, on a Sunday morning, for 4.5 hours. The Israeli poet Edgar Keret, Israeli fiction writer Edgar Keret, and the Palestinian poet Hassan Zaktan debated all these issues for 4.5 hours without either one of them ever raising their voice. It was, I mean, they did not agree, but they engaged in the kind of conversation that I think cultural diplomacy can inspire at its best. And October 7th happened, things get complicated in this WhatsApp group. Eventually the Israeli poet decides to leave early because she can't take the incoming she's getting. We meet, generally speaking, every Tuesday afternoon. We have a group session called Text in Context, and I use it to talk about, let's say, American poetry, American fiction, American politics, creative writing programs, those different things. The last session of this was to be about the historiography of the IWP, going back to Engel and Donoso and those conversations. And I sent an email out and I said, well, and we'll leave space to talk about what's on everybody's mind. So we have our historiography part of Text in Context, and then we have the larger conversation, and it begins in a really strange way. We had a Filipina writer living in Singapore who began the conversation, and she said to me, so you remember that story you told this class? We have an undergraduate class called International Literature today. You remember that story you told about the Israeli writer punching out the Palestinian poet? And I looked at her, I said, that's exactly the opposite of the story I told. I told a story about them debating in the most civilized manner. And ever since I've thought, how did that story, which in my view was an emblem of what the IWP can be, get turned into by somebody smart? I mean, this is a writer who's got many books to her credit. And she's also a content manager of a website in Singapore. How did she get to twist this completely around? And she wasn't the only one who had twisted that story around. For various reasons, it got turned on its head. And so then that was unsettling. We had this conversation. And that night, Edgar Keret has a wonderful Substack, and his weekly post came out, and he had dredged up a story he'd written a few months after that debate with Hassan. And he just would bring it back, and it was about the conversations they were having. How in some ways they couldn't understand each other, but that was to be explored rather than exploited. So I said, apropos of our conversation this afternoon, here's a piece that Edgar wrote about Hassan. And then I got on a plane and flew to somewhere. Had to travel abroad, and one of my staff members wrote to me the next day and said, some of the writers have visited with me, and they've let it be known they don't want to hear anymore from Edgar Carrot, from Israelis about this. And I thought, oh my God, we are doomed. We can't have these kind of conversations. The same thing exists in my program between Ukrainians and Russians. And you know, the fact of the matter is there are always profound differences in a country, in a community, in a continent, around the world. But my hope always is that we can find ways to address some of these issues and see if there aren't places where we can find common ground. At the moment, it seems pretty difficult. And I've had a sense of some of the things going on here in Argentina, and all I can say is good luck. Yeah.
Is it true that you wrote a book about soccer? I mean, football.
I did.
Can you tell us about your experience, and if from you, is the relation between soccer or football and cultural diplomacy, and then poetry?
Yeah, well, here's a funny thing. I grew up in a part of the U.S. in New Jersey, where we didn't play American football. We played soccer. I played for a team called the Newark Sport Club in high school, and I went off to college, frankly, to play soccer and study French. And my thought was, I wanted to be, when I was young, a professional soccer player and a poet. My father, the banker, you can imagine, is thinking about that. The only professional league in the States when I graduated from college, where I played through college, went bankrupt. Soccer it's taken a long time to find a place in the States. But I kept playing. I ended up coaching at the college level for a year. And then in 1989, I was at the Red Loaf Writers Conference at a cocktail party. And I said to an editor, I said, you know, if by some miracle the US gets into the World Cup, you should send me to Italy to write a book about it. And the next morning at breakfast, he came up to me and he said, that was a great idea you had last night. I thought, what? What was the idea? Then by a miracle, the US gets into the World Cup. And I got a contract that was pretty great. I was able to bring my former coach with me to Europe. He would serve as a kind of guide through the World Cup. And we went to St. Gallen, Switzerland, for a friendly between the US and Poland before the World Cup. There we met my former coach's friend and former, he had been the assistant to Roy Hodgson, who had just taken over the Neuchâtel football team, and eventually would go on to manage England and Switzerland and various different things. And so we ended up traveling with Roy for 3 days on a driving tour. He gave me lots of interesting ideas. In fact, he endorsed the book that it's called The Grass of Another Country, long out of print, a journey through the world of soccer. But then we went to the World Cup. I went to matches all the way to the finals. I saw, alas, it did not work out very well for Argentina then. And, that was a sad moment, but I had so much fun writing that book, and I've sometimes said in workshops, in writing workshops, that when I wrote the book over 9 months, my idea was write a page a day and you'll be done. I said write a page a day until I could go to the local brew pub and have a brew, you know. And when I turned the book in after a couple of weeks, my editor sent me a letter that said, it's clear to me that you had a lot of fun in Italy. Now let's see if we can't write a book. But I already wrote a book. You know. And what came back was a manuscript. Every single page was marked up with questions and phrases and sentences circled. And, you know, I wanted to kill myself. But then at a certain point, I realized he had given me a great gift. He had engaged the manuscript at the deepest level. And it gave me new ways to think about rewriting, how to rewrite the book. And I finished writing the book the day before I flew off to the Balkans, where I then would spend several years covering the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia. It's a much different kind of books than what I had written in the grass of another country. But I saw the last flashes of Maradona's genius. But he really didn't have a great World Cup then. So, we could see the end was coming. But so I was so happy to see that Messi finally got his World Cup last fall. So fall before. But I see he's injured now, so he's we have him in the States, thank God. So it's got everybody very excited. I think it might be hard for outsiders to understand how amazingly popular soccer is, not so much on the spectator level, but all kids play soccer. That they rarely play American football anymore. They'll play soccer or basketball. Both of my daughters played soccer, and there was no chance that they would ever want to be professional soccer players. But I think it was a good thing. We have 16 soccer fields in our tiny little city of Iowa City. So and one big football stadium. So,
You used to say what a writer can do in cultural diplomacy, or also what a writer can do in society.
Yeah.
Can you come back to that idea and with your experience to expand a little what a writer can do?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, you're all listening to me in English, so you have at least two languages. And, one thing you can do is translate. There is no pure version of cultural diplomacy than to take a poem or a story from another language, another tradition, another political system, and bring it into your own. We run a translation workshop as a part of the international writing program, and that's integral to my thinking as a writer. I've published 8 books of poems and 6 nonfiction books, but I've also published something like a dozen or 14 or 15 books of translation. And I viewed that work to be as important as anything else that I do. So translation is one thing that everyone can do if they have another language. That's the easy part of it. And then, projects like this, I have the good luck to be working with the State Department with really adept civil servants and diplomats who are among the most creative people I've ever worked with. And they will come to me. Our program officer often says to me, you may think this is a crazy idea and you're free to ignore it or tell me to get lost. And inevitably, she has something interesting like what became Witten and Webb. So whenever, just as a broadly thinking, Jean Cocteau said, never say no, right? As a writer, you never say no because you never know what commission or assignment, where it might lead. And so my general bearing toward the world is, when you wrote and said, would you think about coming to Buenos Aires? And of course I said right away, yes, without thinking. That's it. I had to be in Hong Kong the week before, but because by saying yes, by being open to the possibility of making a connection, of exploring something in greater detail, good things often come from that. So I tend to say yes a lot. More than probably is good for me, but
Que nos quedan 10 minutos. Quiero hacer unas últimas preguntas.
I read your question in a different way. I thought you were asking him, and maybe this is what I'm asking you now, what a writer can do for, not what you can do for your work.
I was thinking,
Yeah,
what you do for
what you can do for diplomacy, what a writer can do for politics, what a writer can do for happiness of the world, if that's something we can aspire to.
One way to talk about how I got started doing this was I was working as a caretaker in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I had flunked out of the PhD program in creative writing. I had no money. and my wife's a violinist, so we were really poor. And I moved to Santa Fe and I was asked if I would take over the Santa Fe Writers Conference. So I was learning how to be an administrator. And then Iran issued the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. And I thought, well, let's organize a reading on behalf of Salman Rushdie. And we did that. We had a huge turnout. And I thought, now that's one tangible thing you can do. A year later, I learned that the college in Santa Fe, St. John's University, was going to give Czesław Miłosz, the Polish Nobel laureate, an honorary degree. So I thought, well, let's see if we can figure out a way to have him also give a reading while he's in Santa Fe. So I communicated with his wife. She was handling all that stuff. We figured out a way to have him give a reading. I was going back and forth with my editor of this book. He was trying to organize something for Gaza. And he said, you know, the problem is there's so many, all the really good Palestinian American writers, they're being asked to do these things everywhere. Did I have names of other Palestinian American poets who might be willing to take part in a reading to raise money for writers in Gaza? This same man, when the war began in Ukraine, we got together to spend time. We've been working on what's called the Ukraine Coordination Group for the Artist Protection Fund. First, it was to find safe haven for writers under attack in Ukraine, and then a lot of writers ended up staying in Ukraine. So he identified an issue, which was that the booksellers and the publishers and libraries were being destroyed, booksellers and publishers had no money. So maybe we could figure out a way to start raising money for the book industry. As it happened, he had already, he began this because he collected old valuable books, sold them off to give to send to Ukraine. We've sent about $60,000 now to booksellers. It's not a lot of money. We're writers, we can't do much, but I think any gesture in sympathy with those who are being attacked is a good thing to do. And so you start small, you do what you can, and try to keep your eyes open for the next chance to engage.
No, just very briefly, I read there is no Spanish program, creative writing in Spanish program. So could you tell us very briefly how that came about and what if the place of Spanish in the US, how is it is changing? How is it changing?
It's so interesting.
Yeah, sorry, I should have asked that first.
I live in Iowa, which is an English-only state. When such a referendum was passed, it was being voted on in California. Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican novelist, said, "What does it mean to have a referendum on English only? It means it isn't only English." So probably about a fifth of the population in Iowa is Spanish speaking. Many having come to work in the agricultural industry. That's just a fundamental part of our life. So when we had this task force on the writing university, a colleague, a Chilean writer named Roberto Ampuero, who had come to the IWP in the 1990s, he had originally left Chile after Allende was assassinated. He was very much on the left. By, let's say, 2008, 2010, he had moved farther to the right and ended up becoming Piñero's Minister of Culture and then Minister of Foreign Affairs. But before he went over, let's say, to the Joint side, he found out about the task force, and he said he had been teaching at Middlebury summer program in Spanish, and they asked him, which is a Spanish language immersion program. They asked him to dream up a new class, and he thought of teaching creative writing in Spanish. We have a long history at the University of Iowa of writers from South America coming to the IWP and then staying on to do a PhD in Spanish or in Portuguese. And Roberto was one of them, Oscar Hahn was another. And so I brought it to the committee and they went for it. And the program is fully subscribed now. It's a lot of the students are from South America. Some of them are alumni of the IWP. Others are heritage speakers who grew up speaking the language. And then there are others, a few who learned the language like my father did once upon a time and decided he became a banker, others are becoming writers. So we have some really terrific writers on staff. The program is run by the Spanish poet, Luis Munoz. And he's a great poet and it's a cool program.
Bueno, thank you very much.